Hi friends, my name's Trish Roberts and you're watching Faint Signals from Vega. So you probably heard about Angela Davis, who's a supporter of the BDS movement, the Boycott, Divestments and Sanctions movement. And she released this statement about the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, which rescinded basically an award, a human rights award, a Fred Shuttleworth's Human Rights Award, because of her support of the Palestinians and the apartheid situation that they're enduring in Palestine, in apartheid Israel. And so she wrote this statement, and I wanted to share it with you. And Angela Davis, you know, she was a part of the Black Panther movement and the Communist Party. She's a long-term civil rights activist. I don't agree with everything she's done, meaning she supported Hillary Clinton, or rather suggested to people to vote for Hillary Clinton in 2016. So I'm not a fan of that. But anyway. This is what Angela Davis put on her Facebook account. She said, "On Saturday, January 5th, I was stunned to learn that the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute Board of Directors had reversed their previous decision to award me the Fred Shuttleworth Human Rights Award. Although the BCRI refused my request to reveal the substantive reasons for this action, I later learned that my long-term support of justice for Palestine was at issue. This seemed particularly unfortunate given that my own freedom was secured and indeed my life was saved by a vast international movement. And I have devoted much of my own activism to international solidarity and specifically to linking struggles in other parts of the world to US grassroots campaigns against police violence, the prison industrial complex, and racism more broadly. The rescinding of this invitation and the cancellation of the event where I was scheduled to speak was thus not primarily an attack against me, but rather against the very spirit of the indivisibility of justice. I support Palestinian political prisoners just as I support current political prisoners in the Basque County, in Catalonia, in India and other parts of the world. I have indeed expressed opposition to policies and practices of the State of Israel, as I express similar opposition to US support for the Israeli occupation of Palestine and to other discriminatory US policies. Though my experience at Elizabeth Irwin High School in New York City and at Brandeis University in the late 50s and early 60s, and my subsequent time in graduate school in Frankfurt, Germany, I learned to be as passionate about opposition to anti-Semitism as to racism. It was during this period that I was also introduced to the Palestinian cause. I am proud to have worked closely with Jewish organizations and individuals on issues of concern to all of our communities throughout my life. In many ways, this work has been integral to my growing consciousness regarding the importance of protesting the Israeli occupation of Palestine. The trip to Birmingham, where I was born and raised, to receive the Fred Shuttleworth's Award was certain to be the highlight of my year, especially since I knew Reverend Shuttleworth personally and attended school with his daughter, Patricia, and because my mother, Salia B. Davis, worked tirelessly for the BCRI during its years. Moreover, my most inspirational Sunday school teacher, Odessa Woolfolk, was the driving force for the Institute's creation. Despite the BCRI's regrettable decision, I look forward to being in Birmingham in February for an alternative event organized by those who believe that the movement for civil rights in this moment must include a robust discussion of all of the injustices that surround us. Angela Y. Davis, January 7th, 2019. So you know, that's incredibly sad, and yet it's not surprising because there's this great push by the Hasbara, which is, you know, an effort by Israel to control the narrative about Israel and apartheid. And there's a great push from AIPAC lobbyists who give so much money to US Congress members, and you know, that are basically, there's a whole lot of a push to try and control this narrative to the extent that they would try to, that they do things like this, you know, unjust things like this to Angela Davis, who very much deserves that award. The BDS movement is probably the only thing now that will bring apartheid to an end, just like it did in South Africa during the days of apartheid. And it was really celebrities and entertainers and businesses withdrawing their business operations, and celebrities not performing at Sun City in South Africa, and all of that. All those various actions, which was boycott, divestment and sanctions, all helped bring an end to apartheid in South Africa, and will be probably the only thing that will bring an end to apartheid in Israel, because there's a large majority of the population too far gone, really, too racist in relation to Palestinians, and in many cases calling it genocidal calls against Palestinians. You know, to the point where they actually think that Bibi Netanyahu, who looks like he's on his way out, is not right-wing enough, is not hard enough and oppressive enough on Palestinians, which really says something, because he's been brutal, and there's an ongoing killing of Palestinians every single day in these occupied territories. So, you know, this is sort of like, it just shows the desperation of Israel, that that's what they are needing to do to try and stop this BDS campaign from continuing. In fact, both sides of Congress, I think they either passed a bill making it illegal or something for people, you know, in the US to support BDS or something like that. I'll have to look into that, but I think that's what happened recently. So, you know, the Democrats and the Republicans they get their lobbyist money from AIPAC, and they basically do what their lobbyists want them to do. So this is why we need to push even harder on the BDS, with the BDS movement, supporting the BDS movement, because it's actually working. That's why Israel is so desperate. It's actually working, and it should work, because what's going on for Palestinians in the apartheid state of Israel is absolutely appalling. It's genocidal, ethnic cleansing, and it's been going on now for decades, and it just gets worse and worse and worse. If you can support Angela Davis there and send words of support to her, that would be a good thing. But support the BDS movement and support Palestinians in any way you can, because Palestine will be free one day, but it's going to be particularly a rough ride trying to continue with BDS, with the sort of the way the US, of course, is pro-Israel. It gives Israel, the apartheid state of Israel, $10 million a day to continue on this oppression of Palestinians and try and wipe them out. Without that money, the apartheid state of Israel would not be able to continue oppressing Palestinians the way it does. So if you're a US citizen, it's very important that you hold every single Congress member to account over this issue of Palestine, and don't vote for those who will not support the BDS movement. Do not vote for people who are not supporting Palestinians and who support an ethno-supremacist state. You know, I mean, we should all want for Palestinians and Israelis to live in harmony and peace in that area. And the two-state solution is dead, because if you've seen how atomized everything is, land has been taken away bit by bit with illegal settlements that are actually illegal under UN resolutions, many UN resolutions, and yet Israel continues to take land from Palestinians, and there's only a very small amount of land left. So a two-state solution is not going to work, only a one-state solution, and I'm not really sure how that's going to work, since, as I said, the majority of Israelis now are seriously, it's so racist towards Palestinians. I don't know how on earth they would all coexist together in that one land, but that's what needs to be done anyway. So that's really all I wanted to say about this issue, really. And by the way, it's not anti-Semitic to criticize Israel, the apartheid state of Israel. And by the way, Arabs are Semitic too. So it's anti-Semitic to allow an ongoing oppression and occupation of a people and not allow refugees, Palestinian refugees, to return to their areas. It's not anti-Semitic to criticize apartheid in Israel, just so you know. Just like they're trying to do that to Jeremy Corbyn. It's so ridiculous to frame things that way. So anyway, support the BDS movement, and I hope that you will check out the Empire Files has some great programs about this situation. They have at least 7 programs about Palestine and about what's happening for Palestinians, and I'll leave a link to that. You can find it on the empirefiles.tv. There's a number of them on there. So I hope that you'll check them out. Okay, so thanks so much for watching. My name's Trish Roberts. You're watching Faint Signals from Vega. Till next time. Bye for now.
This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
We end today's show with the ongoing siege on Gaza after 130 Palestinians were injured Friday while protesting the ongoing Israeli occupation and demanding the right of return. 25 children and 4 paramedics were among the injured. Israel announced it was implementing a, quote, zero-tolerance policy towards protesters in Gaza shortly before 10,000 protesters gathered along Israel's heavily militarized separation barrier with Gaza as part of their weekly Friday protests under the banner of the Great March of Return. The protests began March 30th, and since then, Israeli forces have killed at least 170 Palestinians, including more than 30 children, and injured tens of thousands more.
Meanwhile, Israel has postponed the planned demolition of the Palestinian Bedouin village of Khan al-Ahmar in the occupied West Bank after facing international condemnation. Last week, the International Criminal Court warned Israel that population transfers in occupied territories constitute war crimes. We return now to part 2 of our conversation with Haggai Elad, the executive director of the Israeli human rights group B'Tselem. He was in New York last week on Thursday when he testified before the UN Security Council officially for the first time. I asked Haggai about his message to the world.
So what was key for us is really try to spell out the daily reality for a Palestinian living under occupation in the moments that don't necessarily make the news, when soldiers enter a Palestinian home in the dead of night. And people abroad might assume that they have a search warrant or probable cause or something like that. But no, military law gives almost any soldier the authority to enter any Palestinian home anytime, and the army does. And a million other ways in which Palestinians, day in and day out, have absolutely no control over their lives, have no representation in the Israeli institutions that determine everything in the life of a Palestinian, and to try and explain that, to give flesh and blood to the meaning of living under that regime, not for a month, not for a year, not for a decade, an entire people for more than half a century in that reality.
And there you're talking about the West Bank. In Gaza, people are being killed regularly. There's the Great March of Return protests that began on March 30th. And your official figures for how many people the Israeli military has killed since then?
Yeah, it's more than 170 fatalities. More than 30 of them were minors, under 18. 3 of them were actually children. They were 11 years old. These are the youngest ones that were killed since March 30, and more than 5,300 that were injured from live gunfire. But it's really important for me to emphasize that Gaza is also another example of Israeli control. Israel controls everything between the river and the sea. In Gaza, the control is external. We decide what and who gets in and out of the Gaza Strip, except of the Rafah crossing with Egypt that is closed most of the time. We control the population registry in Gaza. If you're Palestinian in Gaza and you need medical care, not necessarily even in Israel, you need medical care in the West Bank or in Jordan, then you need an Israeli permit for that. We control everything in different ways, directly or indirectly.
I wanted to ask you about Israel's plans to demolish the Palestinian Bedouin village of Khan al-Ahmar. On Monday, Israeli forces arrested 4 villagers, injured 7 people as they protested the arrival of the demolition teams. This is Bedouin villager Ahmad Abu Dahouk speaking last month.
We ask all the free people in the Arab nation to react. It is a war crime. The Israeli authorities want to demolish and evacuate us. Are they going to send us to a better place? No, they will not. They will relocate us to a worse place.
He is speaking from Khan al-Ahmar. Explain what this place is and what's happening.
So this is just a few miles east of Jerusalem in a part of the West Bank known as Area C. That's about 60% of the West Bank, and that's in an area that has been high up on the Israeli list of priorities for a while to minimize Palestinian footprint there, to displace many Palestinians out of that area, and to expand settlements in there. And it exposes in great detail the Israeli hypocrisy in its planning policies used against Palestinians living in the West Bank. There was a letter by the Israeli ambassador actually to the Security Council just a day before my briefing trying to articulate the Israeli argument somehow as if what is about to happen is legal. Why is it legal? Because the Palestinians have been building illegally. Why is it legal? Because this was backed by the Israeli High Court of Justice. Why is this legal? Because Israel was kind enough to offer relocation sites to the community. And all of this are just lies on top of distortions on top of lies. Why are Palestinians building illegally? Because Israel created a planning regime that is meant to serve settlers and to dispossess Palestinians. If you're a Palestinian in Area C in the West Bank, your chances of getting a building permit for Israeli authorities are around 1 in 100. Right? So Palestinians have no other choice, and that's why they built without permission from Israeli authorities. And the Israeli High Court, when it makes a ruling that says that demolition orders are legal, while completely ignoring the context that Palestinians cannot build legally in any way, doesn't make that ruling just or sensible or even formally legal. It only makes the judges of the Israeli High Court complicit in what, if this is indeed will take place, will be the war crime of forcible transfer of protected people in an occupied territory. Khan al-Ahmar is the most visible example of this phenomena these days. A community of some 200 people in that location with a school that serves other communities in the area. But this is happening not only now and not only in Khan al-Ahmar. This is part of a broader Israeli policy to take over as much Palestinian land, minimize Palestinian footprint, concentrate as many Palestinians as possible in the parts of the West Bank known as Area A and Area B, and then say that those areas, like Area A, hey, don't worry about that. That's where Palestinians are running their own lives. Well, in fact, what we're talking about are isolated Bantustans that are getting more and more closed by further and further Israeli settlements in the rest of the West Bank. And in the end, what you have is this picture in which Palestinian life and Palestinian territory and the Palestinian people and spirit are completely broken up into small, digestible, more easily controllable areas. Gaza separated from the West Bank. East Jerusalem walled off the rest of the West Bank. The West Bank itself chopped into these different segments.
You referenced apartheid in your speech to the UN Security Council. You said, take a look at the discriminatory planning mechanisms and the separate legal systems in the occupied territories. They are reminiscent of South Africa's grand apartheid.
Yeah, we try to make a nuanced point there, because often if you make that point, Israel will say, how dare you compare these two realities? We don't have laws that say that, Palestinians and Israelis cannot sit on the same benches, for instance. And indeed, we don't. But that's why the distinction was made there between petty apartheid and grand apartheid. Not those aspects of apartheid, the benches, the separate beaches, and so on and so forth. And I'm not talking here about restrictions on movement, but to focus on the issue of the policies, the legal systems, and of course, voting rights.
You also wrote in Haaretz, what are the Palestinians supposed to do? If they dare demonstrate, it's popular terror. If they call for sanctions, it's economic terror. If they pursue legal means, it's judicial terror. If they turn to the United Nations, it's diplomatic terror. It turns out anything a Palestinian does besides getting up in the morning and saying, thank you, Reis, thank you, master, is terror.
Yeah, this has become so routine in Israel. This has become so normalized after 50 years that people have a difficulty even in accepting that basic right that people live under oppression, have the right to reject that reality. And any avenue that Palestinians try is met with one form or another of condemnation. But for Israel, this is part of a broader agenda. The agenda is not only to overcome Palestinian opposition to their oppression, but also to silence Israelis and to silence the international community. So it goes further, right? If an Israeli is against occupation, she or he must be traitors. If an international is speaking or acting against occupation, they must be anti-Semites, right? And I'm saying that with a lot of cynicism, but this is no laughing matter. This is actually quite an effective silencing mechanism that Israel is deploying continuously all over the world.
This week, the Pope sainted Archbishop Romero, Oscar Romero of El Salvador, who was assassinated in 1980. The last speech he gave before he was gunned down was heard throughout El Salvador on the radio. And he ordered the soldiers, he beseeched them, he pled with them to put down their arms, to defy orders. He said, stop the repression. In April, your group, B'Tselem, called on Israeli soldiers to refuse orders to shoot unarmed protesters. Did they heed?
No. Yeah, we published ads. This is actually also like a legal responsibility, a moral responsibility, not only, I think, from like any decent person, but also according to Israelis' own laws. If a soldier receives a flagrantly illegal command, he is duty-bound not to follow that command. It commands that order soldiers to fire at unarmed protesters that are not endangering anyone from a distance. These are flagrantly illegal commands. They should not have been given, and the responsibility for that is with the country's leadership, with the Prime Minister, Defense Minister, Chief of Staff, and that's where the responsibility begins. That's where the brunt of the responsibility is. But if such orders are given, soldiers are duty-bound not to follow such orders.
I wanted to turn to an emergency room doctor who he interviewed. He's a Canadian doctor, and he went to Gaza to help Palestinians. The Palestinian-Canadian doctor, Tarek Loubani, who was shot by Israeli forces in both legs while he was helping treat Palestinians injured by Israeli forces during the nonviolent Great March of Return. It was May 14th. It was a Monday. I asked Dr. Loubani, this is right after he was shot, if he felt he was targeted as a doctor.
I don't know the answer to that. I don't know what orders they received or what was in their heads. So I can't tell you if we were deliberately targeted. What I can tell you is the things that I do know. In the 6 weeks of the march, there were no paramedic casualties. And in one day, 19 paramedics, 18 wounded plus 1 killed, and myself were all injured. Or were all shot with live ammunition. Musa was actually in a rescue at the time, but everybody else I've talked to was like me. We were away during a lull without smoke, without any chaos at all, and we were targeted, and we were rather hit by live ammunition, most of us in the lower limbs.
So that was Dr. Tarek Loubani, the Canadian Palestinian doctor. We spoke to him just after he was shot. The man he was talking about, paramedic Musa Abu Hassanin, was shot and killed by Israeli forces. He was shot in the chest. Dr. Loubani tweeted a photo captioned, "A haunting photo. Friday, May 11th, left, Mohammed Migdad, shot in the right ankle. Hassan Abu Sada, Tarek Loubani, shot in left leg and right knee. Mumin Silmi, Yusuf Al-Mamluk, Musa Abu Hassanin, shot in the thorax and killed. Volunteer unknown, photographer, shot and wounded." He said this was a photo they had just taken so they could have for their scrapbooks. Talk about this, Haggai.
There's a lot of information also about additional incidents, and I invite viewers to go to the B'Tselem website and read more data and analysis on this reality. What I would want to add is that one can be rest assured that in all likelihood, no one is going to be held accountable to any of these killings. Israel has a well-lubricated whitewashing mechanism that doesn't really investigate. It performs what looks like investigation in order to push against international legal authority. Sometimes it will take a very long time until they will close the case, sometimes a shorter time. But based on our data analysis, more than a decade of working on such issues, both in the West Bank and in Gaza, more than 97% of the time, no one will be held accountable.
Let me ask you about the criticism that you faced in Israel. 2 years ago, our guest, Haggai Elad, spoke first before the United Nations Security Council. The Israeli government threatened to revoke his citizenship. He was then barred from speaking at Israeli schools. Then this is Israeli ambassador to the United Nations, Danny Danon, speaking yesterday.
Mr. Elad, you are a citizen of the State of Israel who serves our enemies. They are using you against us. IDF soldiers protect you, and you come here and smear them. Shame on you. Shame on you, you collaborator.
Shame on you, you collaborated, the Israeli ambassador to the UN said. Haggai Elad, your response?
He said it in Hebrew. No one could understand that in real time at the Security Council chamber, and of course he knew that. He was talking to an Israeli audience back home when he was saying that. 20 seconds before that, he was speaking in English from the same very seat, celebrating Israeli democracy because, hey, we have human rights organizations such as B'Tselem that get to present before the Security Council. It's a perfect example of Israeli hypocrisy at its worst, in the sense that democracy is reduced to a product for expert. That's what we celebrate abroad, the only democracy in the Middle East. But at home, going after the traitors, trying to silence the opposition to the occupation, both things at the same time. By this point, I'm already used to having both of these voices, but usually it will be the Prime Minister and then someone else speaking 5 days later somewhere else, right? But to have the same person within less than a minute do democracy in English, collaborator in Hebrew, absolutely amazing. But to have like a deep understanding of how cynical that is, that's all you need to look at.
What about the Trump administration? Has it changed what's happening on the ground in Israel and the occupied territories? What about the Trump administration's relationship, President Trump, Jared Kushner's relationship with Prime Minister Netanyahu? Prime Minister Netanyahu, his inner circle is increasingly being arrested. The latest charges brought against his own wife, moving in on Benjamin Netanyahu himself, and we see this, something similar happening in the United States with an investigation of President Trump. But what's happening?
I don't want to overcredit Trump and Netanyahu. They haven't begun this. They have both inherited this reality that has begun many years before that in Israel by governments left, right, and center that were part of the occupation project. I don't want to shy away from that history in that context. At the same time, of course, Trump is making everything much worse. And the sense in Israel of like this government that not only they have a green light from the White House to basically get away with almost anything they want to do, but in fact that what they have here is, from their perspective, a concern, a limited time, window of opportunity in which to advance Israel's occupation project with no fear of consequences from the U.S., with no fear of anything happening at the Security Council because of the American veto. And that is scary.
That was Haggai Elad, the executive director of the Israeli human rights group B'Tselem, in New York last week, where he testified before the UN Security Council officially for the first time.